In the late summer of 1969, a wave of violence gripped Los Angeles, shattering any sense of peace. Charles Manson directed a faction of his young adherents to carry out brutal acts over 2 consecutive nights. On August 8th of that year, members of the group known as the Manson Family proceeded to a residence in the Hollywood Hills occupied by actress Sharon Tate. Inside, they attacked Tate and her companions, Jay Sebring, a well-known hairstylist, Abigail Folger, an heiress, and Wojciech Frykowski, a writer. The victims endured stabbings, beatings, and fatal gunshot wounds. Earlier, as the assailants approached the main house, they intercepted Stephen Parent, a teenager visiting someone in the guest house. Parent was shot and killed. As events unfolded, the city was enveloped in fear following these widely publicized killings. The violence, however, was not yet concluded. The subsequent night, Manson accompanied some followers, including Leslie Van Houten, to the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. Decades later, reflecting on his culpability, Charles Manson's statements would vary wildly. He sometimes refuted involvement in the killings. At other times, he seemed to claim responsibility, as during a parole hearing in 2012. He reportedly stated then, "I have put 5 people in the grave. I am a very dangerous man." Subsequently, following his conviction for orchestrating the murders, Manson remained incarcerated for almost 5 decades. His death occurred in 2017 at the age of 83 while still serving his sentence. Among Manson's followers was Leslie Van Houten, whose life had taken a tumultuous turn years earlier. Once a high school cheerleader, her path changed significantly around age 14 after her parents divorced. During this period, she became involved with drugs. She experienced a pregnancy, followed by what she described as a forced abortion mandated by her mother. Van Houten eventually encountered Manson at an old movie ranch outside Los Angeles, where his commune-like family was based. She became part of the group. She was not present during the killings at the Tate residence. However, Van Houten did participate in the events at the LaBianca home the following night. Accounts indicate she restrained Rosemary LaBianca, while others inflicted numerous stab wounds. Then, following an instruction from Charles Tex Watson to actively participate, Van Houten reportedly used a knife, stabbing the already wounded woman multiple times. Throughout her decades of incarceration, Leslie Van Houten pursued education, earning both bachelor's and master's degrees. She also became involved in leading programs aimed at inmate rehabilitation. Despite being recommended for parole on 3 occasions, her release was consistently denied by the governor then in office. Following the horrific events of August 1969, intense investigations commenced, leading to the arrest of Charles Manson and several of his followers. The subsequent trial captivated and horrified the nation. Prosecutors worked to establish Manson's control over his adherents and his orchestration of the murders, even though he wasn't physically present at the Tate residence killings. During this period, the motive presented by the prosecution involved Manson's belief in an impending, apocalyptic race war, which he termed Helter, Skelter, derived from a Beatles song title. The prosecution argued Manson intended the killings to be blamed on black radicals, thereby igniting the conflict he envisioned. The trial itself was tumultuous, marked by disruptions from the defendants and intense media scrutiny. Ultimately, Manson, Van Houten, Charles Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Krenwinkel were convicted of murder and conspiracy. They were initially sentenced to death. However, in 1972, the California Supreme Court invalidated the state's death penalty statute, commuting all existing death sentences to life imprisonment. This meant Manson and his convicted followers would become eligible for parole hearings after serving a minimum number of years. Susan Atkins, another participant in both nights of killing, often expressed remorse in later years before her death from cancer while incarcerated in 2009. Patricia Krenwinkel, also involved in both the Tate and LaBianca murders, remains incarcerated and has similarly been denied parole multiple times despite expressing remorse. Charles Tex Watson, a key figure who led the killings at both locations, remains imprisoned as well, having become a minister while incarcerated. The Manson murders sent shockwaves through American society, often cited as a dark endpoint to the counterculture idealism of the 1960s. The brutality and seemingly random nature of the violence instilled a deep sense of fear and vulnerability, particularly in Southern California. For decades, the parole hearings for the convicted members continued to generate public debate and media attention, reopening wounds for the victims' families. As events unfolded over nearly 50 years, the narrative surrounding Manson and his followers remained a stark reminder of charismatic manipulation and extreme violence. The legacy of those August nights in 1969 endures, a somber chapter in American history marked by terror and loss. Charles Manson himself had spent much of his youth and early adulthood in correctional institutions before emerging into the counterculture scene of the late 1960s. During this period, specifically around 1967's Summer of Love in San Francisco, Manson began attracting followers, often young people adrift and seeking belonging. He possessed a charismatic, albeit manipulative, persona, weaving together philosophies drawn from various sources, including fringe interpretations of religion and popular music. Subsequently, the group, which became known as the Family, moved south, eventually settling at Spahn Ranch, an old movie set outside Los Angeles. Life at the ranch involved communal living, psychedelic drug use, and increasing isolation from mainstream society, fostering intense loyalty to Manson. Manson exerted powerful psychological control, using music, fear, and purported prophecies to bind his followers to him. His teachings grew darker, focusing on societal collapse and his designated role as a leader in a coming new order. As events unfolded, this absolute control conditioned his followers to accept and eventually carry out extreme acts of violence under his direction. Before the August 1969 killings, the group was already implicated in other criminal activity, including the murder of Gary Hinman in July of that year, a crime motivated by money disputes. The investigation into the Tate LaBianca murders initially struggled to connect the crimes or identify suspects, adding to public anxiety. A crucial breakthrough occurred later when Susan Atkins, incarcerated on unrelated charges, began talking about her involvement in the killings to fellow inmates. This information eventually reached law enforcement, providing the critical link needed to unravel the case and identify Manson and his followers as the perpetrators. The subsequent legal proceedings confirmed the depth of Manson's influence and the chilling willingness of his adherents to commit murder on his command. Leading the prosecution team was Vincent Bugliosi, who later co-authored a detailed account of the crimes and trial. His efforts were crucial in piecing together the complex narrative of Manson's control and the group's actions. A key element of the prosecution's case involved testimony from Linda Kasabian, a family member who had accompanied the killers but did not directly participate in the murders. Kasabian became the state's primary witness, providing first-hand accounts of the events on both nights in exchange for immunity. Her testimony was vital in securing the convictions. During the trial, the defendants often engaged in disruptive behavior, attempting to derail the proceedings and displaying unwavering loyalty to Manson. At one point, Manson and his followers carved symbols into their foreheads, further adding to the bizarre and unsettling atmosphere surrounding the case. Throughout the era, the trial dominated headlines, fueling widespread public fascination and apprehension about cults and charismatic leaders. The brutality detailed in court shocked sensibilities and underscored a dark undercurrent beneath the optimistic facade of the late 1960s counterculture. Subsequently, the Manson case had a lasting impact on the perception of communal living movements and alternative lifestyles. It also spurred ongoing debates about the nature of evil, psychological manipulation, and the legal definition of culpability for acts orchestrated but not physically performed by a leader. In the decades following the convictions, Charles Manson remained a figure of dark fascination, receiving mail, interviews, and maintaining a certain notoriety from behind prison walls until his death. Regarding Leslie Van Houten, parole boards recommended her release multiple times in later years, citing her rehabilitation efforts and length of incarceration. After previous denials by governors, a significant development occurred in 2023 when, following another parole recommendation and subsequent court decisions, Van Houten was released from prison after serving over 5 decades.